Every time I talk about Israel and the West Bank, people say to me, well, have you been there? And I say, no. They say, then you don't know what you're talking about until you've been there. You know, I've now concluded that I don't think people who have been there know what's going on. Because I'm learning from a son of an Israeli general, a Jew who was born in Jerusalem and grew up there, about how things really are. So I'd just like you to hear what he has to say. This short video features Miko Peled, a Jewish peace activist on the deprivation of Palestinians in the West Bank.
Of dollars in the West Bank, but only for one purpose, to bring Israeli Jews into the West Bank. Not a dime was invested for the Palestinians, who make up the majority of the population in the West Bank. And we're talking about, sometimes people have this impression that the settlements are these little, little villages or small towns, little outposts. We're talking about major cities, schools and highways and malls. We're talking about major investment. So when again, when you look at what Israeli politicians, cabinet members, generals, the things that the way they viewed the result of the war, the way they viewed the conquest of the West Bank, and their enthusiasm of beginning the settlement projects in the West Bank, this whole notion that somehow Israel was willing to negotiate, and Israel was willing to return the territories, and Israel is willing to do all these things, you can see it's a complete myth. If they're willing to do this, why did they invest so heavily? Why did they build all these cities and towns in the West Bank? Why did they kick out so many hundreds of thousands of people from within the West Bank and from Jerusalem? It just doesn't add up. And again, the same process that took place in the rest of Palestine, the rest of Israel after 48, where investments were made for Israeli Jews and Palestinians were completely disenfranchised. The same thing happened in the West Bank, of course, because this was the continuation of the same process. And so, when you look today, when you drive through the West Bank, what do you see? You see these settlements, the major ones, with swimming pools and green lawns and beautiful villas and so on and so forth. There's malls and everything, and meters away, really meters away, you see Palestinian communities that barely have water. And sometimes they say, well, yes, these communities are so remote that the water doesn't reach them, or they're so remote that the electricity doesn't reach them. But when you have a settlement next to it, it reaches them the next day. Somehow the water and the electricity have no problem, or the roads, paved roads, have no problem reaching these areas when there's an Israeli Jewish settlement there. They only have trouble reaching them when it's a Palestinian community. And the issue of water, of course, is a very important issue. It came to me, actually by chance. I was at the refugee camp, the Dehesha refugee camp, with my son. And I have a picture of him in Dehesha in the book, and the look on his face of the shock at what he saw. What the refugee camp looks like. It's 13,000 people living on 1/4 square mile, 1 square quarter mile. And there's a beautiful community center there called Phoenix House. And the reason it's called Phoenix House is because they built it and the Israelis destroyed it. And they built it again, Israel destroyed it again. And on and on and on, it prevailed and it's still there. So they call it Phoenix House. And it's a very nice facility. It's the only facility, really, serious facility that's available to the people in the camp. But there's no swimming pool. And I thought, why don't you have a swimming pool here? That would be a great idea in a place like this. And they looked at me kind of like, you really don't get it, do you? There is no water. The Israeli authorities closed the water, and I have several friends who live there. And when I see them, sometimes they go for days without water. Why? They don't know. But they closed the water to the camp. 13,000 people for days without water. Not because there is no water available. It's because there's no water available to them. And of course, a large portion of the water that Israel takes, that Israel uses, comes from the West Bank. It's called the Mountain Aquifer. It's one of the largest sources of good water that exists there. And the way Israel controls the water is very interesting, because Israel has the water authority, and they control and allocate the water. So Israelis get something around 300 cubic meters of water per person per year. Palestinians get somewhere between 30 and 80 cubic meters of water per person per year. So why do they wash less? Do they drink less? Do their trees need less water? How does anybody justify this? And yet, the settlers in the West Bank are allocated 1,500 cubic meters of water per year. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. And again, you have Palestinian communities, villages and towns that have no water. How would you feel? And yet they dare to resist. And then they dare to protest. And that they dare to, throw Qassam rockets or do whatever they do. How dare they? And we're so good to them.
Let us pray for peace, our most precious gift.